Sure. Let me figure out where my screen is. All right, so share. All right. You guys can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So first of all, right now I am in a coffee shop, and if you hear some noise, I apologize. Um, but yeah, so there's some background noise. And so my name is Vivek. I work for Stripe, so it's a payments company. And right now I am trying to move to Nepal and make a base here, right? So I think it's a pretty nice opportunity having worked for Stripe, which is like really large company, and there's a lot of patterns that are used there. I've seen similar patterns used in Shopify, where I used to work before. And I just thought, I was talking with some of the developers here, some of the companies here. I realized that there are a lot of different ways that people do things, and maybe sharing the way things are done at Stripe might, help people get some new ideas, right? So that's mainly the goal of this presentation. So the title is Testing Directly in Production, right? So the subtitle is No Dedicated QA Role, No Staging Servers, Faster Deploys, and Better Code Ownership. Yeah, and let's get started. So yeah, so let's say a typical workflow in a company, right? You can see the workflow on the right side. What happens is you will have a developer, you will do a lot of testing in localhost, and after doing some tests, if we have dedicated QA role, what we would do is we'd push it to staging server. Then we would most likely ping a QA and say, hey, I've just pushed this to staging server. Can you do the test? And the QA basically knows, like, hey, so the developer is talking about these kind of features, and these are the things that I need to test. The QA needs to be aware of that and do the actual testing. And does it work? If it doesn't work, then the QA would file a bunch of different bugs. The developer will go look into it and then fix it. And then that cycle continues. The cycle at the very top continues. And if the QA, like all the checklists are crossed and everything works, then there's some process, either the QA or the developer, or there's some automated system that will send things to production. So this is kind of like the workflow that I've seen in some companies, right? I'm sure like a lot of your experiences might be different, right? So what are the issues with this? In my opinion, I've divided it into 3 different columns. Looking from a developer's perspective, like a developer basically is the person who has the most context, right? So the developer is actually building the feature. So the developer knows what is being worked on, all the different edge cases where bugs might occur, so that basically the thing is the main context is with the developer. So in the previously described setup, what happens is that the responsibility for the developer usually ends at, hey, it works at localhost. I've already pushed it to staging. Now it's not my job anymore, right? So I've seen that syndrome with a couple of people as well, right? And talking about QA role, what happens is it's usually like the most stressed out position in a company. Why? Because first of all, the QA is not involved in development, but the QA somehow has to be aware of all the different features by a bunch of different developers, and the QA has to be on top of it. And every time the QA needs to set things up, he or she has to make sure that it's properly set up first, go through a list of different steps, like, hey, let me sign up, and then add this user to particular role. Can this user do this, or can user not do that? So there's a lot of things that QA constantly needs to do. So it's like just a very repetitive role, right? And the other thing with QA is that all the edge cases that a developer knows are maybe not aware, that the QA is not aware of. So QA can miss certain edge cases. And I've seen this to be one of the roles where people are usually very burnt out. So, and then lastly, I want to focus on most like the deployment status, right? The deployment process, sorry. And with the flow we saw earlier, what happens? Like the developer pushes to staging, a QA takes staging. There is like the verification process, and then eventually things get shipped to production. So now imagine there are multiple developers. There is maybe like one single staging server. There is resource contention, right? So if I want to get the QA to test my stuff, but somebody else wants to have QA look into that as well, then how do we work it out? And there's always like, hey, I want to reserve it for, I don't know, an hour or half a day. And then somebody else is like, blocked because features are not being rolled out. So those are issues as well. And then again, the feedback cycle is slow because the developer is waiting on QA to approve stuff before things are shipped. So there's a lot of, like, as soon as there are multiple roles involved, multiple processes involved, things are naturally slow. So can we do better, right? And before we're talking to can we do better, there's also this thing of like, hey, I've tested everything in staging, now let's deploy. But do we feel confident just because things are working in staging, is it going to work in production? Sometimes setups are different, right? So you have different network setup, different CDN or caching strategies. There are just basically like smaller things that could be different. So staging is not the same as production, and there's always this nagging feeling that maybe like something is broken in production. So eventually we have to do some sort of test in production anyways, right? So the testing in production, basically both companies that I've worked for, Shopify and Stripe, where we have 1,000+ developers working in the same code base, like a huge number of developers, right? They work in the same code base, and the things are being continuously delivered or deployed multiple times a day. This is the setup that I've seen. What happens? Like the same thing, developer, it works on a feature, writes a bunch of unit tests, make sure that everything is working properly in localhost. There's the tests pass, you manually look through the interface and everything is working fine. So yeah, works in localhost. Then the developer usually opens up a pull request, and then and then also adds screenshots of all the different features. It could be like a screen recording, a GIF, or like it's a video, and that is added on a pull request, so that the reviewers have an easy time identifying what is being discussed in the pull request. Reviewers can, so like may, right? It's not necessary, but reviewers may choose to pull that branch, test it locally, give feedback. They may not. It's not absolutely necessary. But then this next step is where things get different. So right away, developers then ship the features to production. And then because when things are merged into master, all the unit tests are still passing. Tests are like an important part of the whole process, right? So the developer herself is now responsible for logging, like monitoring the deployment. Then after the deployment is complete, logging into the production and testing their own features. Is it working? Are there any bugs? Then if there are bugs after all that testing locally, which can happen, right? They will do a rollback. Hey, this is breaking certain things. We need to roll it back. They can sometimes fix forward by shipping new changes to fix the issue. And if things are working fine, that's done, right? That's the bottommost step. So as you can see, the developer who's responsible owns the whole process end to end. Nobody's really blocking them except the reviewer of the pull request, right? They're responsible for the deployment. They're responsible for testing in production, and then finally saying, hey, everything is working. So, but then testing in production isn't like, it's not as simple, right? Like, because there is production data. Let's say you're building a form collecting people's information, some sort of survey, and all of a sudden you log in and then you start adding test data that will that will basically mix in with the production data. So to separate your data, basically companies I've seen use two main things in their applications, right? One is feature flags, and one is test mode data. So on the second column, you can see feature flag. The idea is really simple. Feature flags usually are these toggle switches which are turned off by default, right? So what happens is when you ship a new feature, instead of replacing existing code completely, you would have an if-else logic. And you would say, hey, if this feature flag is turned on, use this new logic, use this new code path. And if the feature is turned off, use the existing code path. And what happens is when you ship, basically by default, the feature flag is not turned on, and then all the existing users will go through the old code path, right? I'll come back to this in later slides. And then combine that with test mode data is what happens is like most of the tables, they have a property example is test. Most of the production data will have is test as false, but the data that you enter for testing purposes will have is test equals to true. So, so this is a screen grab I took from this open source platform called Flagsmith, where you can see they provide an interface where you can, toggle certain things, and all of a sudden the application looks different. That gives you a general idea of how feature flags could be used in your application, right? And this is just one offering of many different offerings. So at Stripe, you can see on the right side, let's say from line number 2 to line number 7, we have a very simple controller, and that basically handles any new orders placed. And line 4 and 5 are, like your existing code. Now you want to, like switch to a new order manager, let's say, the line number 5, right? So instead of replacing it directly with a new order manager, which, you might not be fully confident of, then what you do is so line number 9 to line number 19 is the new code, right? So what you do is you would have the if else. You can see it in line number 13. If the flag is enabled for the current user, use the new code path. Else, use existing code path. Of course, it adds an additional complexity. You would have to write more tests. You have to write, so the existing test is there. You have to write new tests saying, hey, test this with the flag enabled. But you can see like it's testing for a current user, right? So what happens then? At Stripe, we have this new flag called use new orders manager that is turned off. Then if I am shipping that feature, I will say, hey, for my user, I have a user ID, turn this flag on. So when I log in and then I do, my usual testing, it will take the new code path, right? So, and when I am confident that the new feature works, then what I will do is I will roll it out for all users. So there are multiple ways of implementing this, especially in Stripe's in-house built feature flag management system. We, sometimes look at user IDs. We can look at client IDs. We can also do percentage-based rollout. For example, hey, for 1% of the next request, or for 5%, 20%, 100% of the next request, enable the feature flag, right? So that means that you can also have gradual rollout. Let's say you're not super confident about your own new code. You can, like let it run for 5% for a while, and then no new errors are popping up. So then you set it to 20%, slowly to 50%, to 100%. So that's how feature flags are used at Stripe. I haven't really used any of the open source offerings yet, but just a quick Google shows there are a bunch of different open source offerings. Usually feature flags, now what happens is like there are feature flag servers uses like just like a database server, you have a feature flag server that provides you with an admin interface. Then you go there, you create your new flag, and then you integrate that with your application. So let's say if you're working with Rails, or you're working with Laravel, or any different like front-end app, JavaScript, there are API clients, I think, for most of the different frameworks as well as programming languages. I'm really looking forward to using Unleash. I think GitLab uses Unleash to roll out their own features. I'm looking forward to using Unleash in a new upcoming project. However, like, it's important to keep a close eye on errors during deployment, right? It's not for free. Like all these, like, so this is not necessarily super easy. Just install something and then you have all these nice things, right? Right. So and be ready to roll back your PRs. Like, keep your eyes fixed at the monitoring tools when you're deploying, and then when you're rolling out your feature flags, and if you see an error pop up that was not caught by your unit test, then you need to roll back your PRs, right? So those are feature flags. Now combine that with test mode data. So this is a screenshot of a production application that that I'm working on. So what happens here is you can see a lot of different, so this is a multi-tenant system where you have a lot of different cities, I guess, and the cities have their own clubs. What I did was, basically we need some way to create data in production database that is marked as test. So at the very bottom, there is a league called Home League that I created myself. And every time I deploy something, I enable it for that particular platform. And then I go ahead, create all the new data. They're all within this particular league. And then none of the production environments are contaminated. So that is like one of the solutions that I've seen, especially in multi-tenant applications, multi-tenant systems. But I've also seen, if you don't have multi-tenancy, what happens is that you mark certain users as your test user, and then any data that is created by the test user has that test is set to true, which means you have to be aware that when you're exporting your records, when you're like generating reports, when you're creating numbers, you need to make sure that you filter out all those test data. And last slide. So, I mean, definitely I think some people might have worked with this kind of systems. Some people might not have. If you haven't, then it is definitely it requires a change of your mindset, right? Because you're dealing with new kind of system. You're trying to implement something that you might not have worked before. So it requires initial investment in integration of feature flag server and test mode data awareness. And you also need to have good monitoring tools, logs, alerting in place, and in general paying a close attention to the system's health. And you need to write tests. The application needs to have good test coverage, because when you're shipping new features, you're not really looking into everything. You're just testing your own new features, and you're hoping that anything new, like the existing unit tests, will catch any kind of regression. But even though there are these challenges, I think it's really worth it, because these are anyways best practices for development and shipping, right? I believe, after you've made the initial investment, it really enables developer to ship things faster, right? It removes a lot of different, manual processes. It removes all the human dependencies. You don't have to wait for QA to come back to you. You are more likely to figure out any bugs in your application yourself, right? Because you're the one who's doing the testing. You know that all the different edge cases, so you're aware of, like, hey, I need to test this and this under these circumstances, right? And finally, I think it also allows the developer to own the work end to end. The idea of, like, hey, it works on localhost. It's not my business whether it works in production or not. That doesn't happen. I think developers are more like, hey, I want to make sure that this goes out to real world people in a successful manner, right? And that overall increases teams' efficiency and velocity. So yeah, so those are, yeah, I think some of the benefits of implementing a system like this. Yeah, and finally, I guess I want to open up the space for people to chime in with their own experiences. How do you guys ship your features in your company? Or any feedback on the presentation, any questions, you can ask right away or email me at vivek@hey.com. Right, I will continue sharing screen if you guys want to go back to previous screens.
Cool. Thanks, Bibek. Great presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I have one. I was wondering, like, what if that our feature flag, feature branch failed and we roll back? And what about the contaminated data on production? How are we gonna deal with that one? Because that's have like huge traffic.
So contaminated data, as in, so let's say if you ship something and then the new logic would write the data in a different format and you roll back and then that format cannot be read.
Yes.
That could happen. There's no solution for that, right? Like, that's why you just have to be careful. You have to be more aware of like, hey, how are you shipping things? Right. So usually in our pull request, we usually have this, a checkbox that will ask you, can I roll this PR or not? And in a situation like that, you might as well fix forward, right? Like instead of rolling back, you implement a fix and move forward.
Yes. So you just told me that there's no any fix for that. So I'm just wondering, can we just revert back to those data as well?
Well, so because code is something that's easily, like you can move back to different versions. But let's say if you have a database and you've already replaced certain data, like the data has one structure, it's a JSON, and you are writing it in a different. So let's say you converted a field from a nillable to non-nillable, right? And then you roll back and you're starting to write nil in that database. So those things, database doesn't have that versioning, right? So it's I think on the individual to be careful, like, hey, what are the issues that might happen when you roll back? And things like that happen. Like I've seen it happen, and then that usually causes downtime anyways. But over time, I think developers become aware of what happens when you roll back certain PRs, what has already changed in the database, things like that. Yeah, so there is no like a single like a golden solution for a database changes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Just a bit of experience on our side. We used to use we still do in House, have a custom Redis and feature flag system where you can set up by cookies. So if you're using, say, Cypress, you basically just set your cookies and then say, okay, I want to test this feature, and it'll delve deep into that side of the code. And we do test on production with our golden sanities with Cypress, with test users, as you kind of showed there as well. And that's all automated. We are now using Unleash as well, and that's tied directly into our Kubernetes operations as well to roll back, do canary builds and canary deployments, and just sort of roll that out slowly across users. You can also roll it to a specific user instead of 5% if you are just a lone developer in production, just testing it out in production yourself as a single developer. So you can actually just sort of say, okay, for this developer, we're just turning it on for this user ID, or for these users in Australia, for example, or in this locale. So it becomes a lot easier to test it out and roll it out across globally, because your feature might be perfect for a small subset, and you want to see, okay, B2B logic, or sorry, A/B testing it or doing business logic to see does a feature pick up. So maybe a global market like, a market like Australia, which is much smaller, English speaking, would be better than rolling it out to say 60 million people in the United States. So you've got to slowly do it. So you're better off doing it to 2 or 3 million people in Australia and then slowly do it to the rest of the globe. But yeah, definitely feature flags are awesome. So really good way to do it.
Is there, do you have dedicated QA still on staging server and stuff?
We have staging servers, we have dedicated QA. We have a lot of manual testing still. We're in the process of converting a lot of that manual work over to automated work. There's a lot, you're looking at like 10, 15 years of code that's still in operation in places, there's a lot of hidden bodies. So that's what the QA's focus is writing automated specs and just doing it in a nice, clean, constructive manner. And that takes a lot of the pressure off the developers as well, because, not only does the developer, are they required to have their specs, but the QA can then focus on end-to-end testing rather than individual component testing, whereas the developer can focus on the small component and that section. Otherwise, they'll be there for days trying to figure stuff out. So, yeah, it's I can't see us giving up our QA team because, it's quite valuable still. Does Stripe have a QA team, or is it all dependent on the developer? Wow.
No,
okay.
Both Shopify and Stripe I've worked for, we have no QA. That was the big change when I joined these companies. And right off the bat, when you open up a pull request, there's a section that developers have to fill in saying like, hey, these are the screenshots. This is how I tested locally, right? And then after that, it's on me to go test in production and
so
make
the
sure
onus
it's working,
is
right?
completely on the developer.
Absolutely.
It's very much a Rails mentality. I think, like test-driven development or Rails development is usually a Ruby development.
Right.
It's always about testing.
And I think it's besides being like a little bit faster, I think it's the ownership, I think, is shared by the reviewers. So the reviewers have to be very careful what they approve and what they don't, right? And therefore, things break, right? It's natural for things to break. It's natural for things to roll back and fix forward. We have downtimes here and there. But I can never imagine having to wait on QA for approval. That would be pretty tough. So because with 1,000+ developers, it's very important that things are always moving, right? So there's a lot of teams involved. So there is continuous integration that gives us feedback if things are broken somewhere else because of my change. So sometimes things I write or change can break things in a completely different team, and I'm not aware of that. Those are usually caught by our continuous integration. But yeah, as soon as that passes, and things are bunched together and then deployed to production. So
what's interesting on our side is you mentioned QA is the blocker, or could be potentially be regarded as a blocker. We look at QA as as an equal partner at the beginning of the process. So QA is very much involved with the product manager to develop the product spec, the feature spec, break it down into the specs at that point. So that actually further defines it for the developer going forward. However, often we find the specs are there for manual testing, but it's usually automated testing is a nice to have, but it's not always going to be there to block the spec being released. But what the QA has given the developer is that set of specs to be able to say, well, this is what we think you should be building. This is what you should build. If you build anything that doesn't fulfill these criteria, then it shouldn't be released. Why are you sending that to production? So that's the question, I think. And it's not so much that they're blocking it, they're assisting to kind of say, this is the standard you need to get to before it goes into production.
Right. No, I mean, in situation like that, I can totally see the value of a QA, right? Yeah. Anybody else have experience with QA roles? Want to share their experience, how they deploy, how they ship things?
I'm waiting for somebody to say we don't have tests. We don't test anything. We just do it live.
I've seen that as well.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people believe that is faster, and the QA is their tests.
Yes.
So in this process, do you write like test cases for the feature that you're developing in your company, like develop a test, write the test themselves, test cases, unit test or end-to-end test, or?
Yeah, we usually do. So, I mean, personally, like the way I mean, I don't necessarily follow test-driven development, right? But what I do is like, let's say there is something that it's a new change that I'm working on. I would open up a test file, maybe it already exists. I will just like write down all the different specs, like Jonathan said, right? Like, hey, if a user is logged in and has this role, then they can edit this resource. If it's not logged in, or there's another one, if it's logged in but doesn't have the role. So I go through a bunch of different scenarios in my head, and I just like write like the names, right? Like the test cases, and then just as a reminder, and it guides me like, okay, so like I need to be aware of these things, and then it's like filling out the test case and actually writing that code goes hand in hand, right? Like I make sure that one test pass, and then this is the implementation is there. And you'd be surprised, like writing those down, like you think that you've covered most of the stuff, but at some point, like one of those tests fails, like, oh man, all right, that's interesting. I'm glad I wrote that because I didn't, if that was missing, I would have completely missed this edge case, right? It happens a lot. But yes, to answer your question, we write unit tests quite a bit. But when it comes to integration tests, those are like, like let's say an automated end-to-end test, those are quite complicated. It's not something that you just like write, run in your local host. Those I think are very dependent on company to company, because let's say if you have a lot of different microservices, then you got to make sure like, hey, the entry point is this microservice, it will touch these couple of microservices, and then something else will happen. So that requires like more thought process, more planning. And I think that depends from company to company. But yeah, at certain like unit tests, we try to cover most of the edge cases.
What are you using for end-to-end testing at the moment in Stripe? Is that handled by the developers, or is there a specific team that manages that?
So usually like there is, so as an example, we started writing some we call it like synthetic tests, right? What happened last year was that so at Stripe, which is a payments company, and there are a lot of different payments that's happening, right? Like you have payments coming from bank transaction, from cards, from tap. Like different countries have their own system. Like say if Nepal was integrated with Stripe, maybe we'll integrate PhonePe. All of these are different methods, right? And at the end of the day, we have to generate some kind of like a tax document. So we were missing some of these charges, some of these transactions, a special type of transactions, and then that became an incident. So to make sure that I mean, unit tests will not account for it, because new types of transactions are added by many different teams spread across like all over the world, right? And we're just a small tax team, let's say. So what we ended up doing was we ended up mandating different teams to send a real transaction, and it costs like certain cents, and it happens every day, and it goes through our API, and then we make sure that at the end of, after running those things, at the end of the day, the totals are compared. And that is like exercising the real API, and that's like an end-to-end test, right? And that was born out of the necessity of not missing any kind of transactions. So things like that happen. As an example, and not like so sometimes you dedicated a certain group of engineers depending upon the severity of the issue. Form a small team, like, hey guys, can you fix this? Can you go ahead and write this thing, or can you get the other teams involved? So yeah.
Thanks.
No problem. Yeah, so this is my email. Feel free to reach out to me.
Cool. Anybody have any other questions for Bibek? Okay.
One last thing. I am based in Nepal right now, so I'm happy to chat. Also, like on Slack. I think I really want to focus on transferring some of the knowledge that I have. So if anybody wants to ask questions about like how things happen at scale, I'm really excited to talk about these things.
Awesome.